Uri, thank you very much for the being here. It's very generous. Unfortunately, you couldn't come. Hopefully, next one, three is a charm. And it's been a fantastic event so far, and I guess it's going to be even much more now. Professor Uri Maoz is at Chapman, and he's also the head of the Neurophilo of Free Will Society. And I mean, needs no further introduction. Is big thinker of all of this things, big promoter of in our field. So it's great to have you, Uri, and we are eager to hear from you.
Thank you. So should I plan for about an hour for my talk? Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the kind introduction. And yes, so I'll talk to you today about why neuroscience and philosophy need each other in the study of volition, or at least they do, in my opinion. So as an example case, let's imagine it's a brisk day outside. So we're probably not in Brazil, but still, it's a brisk day outside, and slightly chilly, and you get up there on the platform and you're going to jump into the pool. So when exactly do you jump, right? I mean, you could argue that at some point you're going to jump. It's maybe your friends are there, they're looking at you. At some point you're gonna jump. But of course, exactly when you jump is up to you, right? You can also imagine, I don't know, you're at the gym and you finished one set and you want to start on the next set. You will start at some point, but exactly when is up to you. So this question, that is one of the basic questions of the neuroscience behind volition, is one that we have been trying to tackle in the field for a while. And in my humble opinion, this question is part of this field, the neuroscience behind volition, that I view as the greatest problem on Earth. But of course, I'm not very objective. So if you bear with me for a moment and would indulge me, I will ask that whenever you feel like it, just raise one of your hands, whenever you feel like it. Go ahead and do that, just so that it'll help you later in this talk. Okay. So, I mean, we can say that the sequence of events was that, I asked you, I guess I'm this cartoon scientist in this thing. So I asked you to raise one of your hands. That meant that at some point you thought, okay, I'm going to raise one of my hands, and then you raised your hand, right? So there was if you think about this in time, so you kind of maybe thought about it, well, and then at some point you go, you know what? Okay, I'm going to raise my hand now. And then you decide which hand you want to raise. So the experience that you probably had was that it was up to you. You decided when and what to move. It's not something, of course, that was random. So you control your movement. Of course, I did not make you move at a specific time. I didn't use TMS or something else to make your hand move. So, and it might be that my request created a general desire, a general urge to move that then at some point resulted in the specific movement. But again, the specific time is really up to you. So as I mentioned before, I see this question as part of the bigger question of the neuroscience behind volition, which is, how really does your brain enable a coherent decision-making process that really takes your thoughts and your ideas and transforms them from your mind into the world, right? So it could be this simple question here that, raise your hand whenever you feel like it, that then you raise your hand, or it could be the example I gave you before. You're thinking about it, okay, I'm going to jump, and then at some point you're going to jump into the pool. And of course, this ties into the more general question of free will, right? Generally speaking, healthy adult humans have this experience of being in control of their decisions, of their actions. In other words, people typically experience that their behavior is up to them. So a big question in the debate on free will over millennia was to what extent that experience aligns with the laws of physics, perhaps especially determinism at the right level. I mean, earlier on, it was more of a perhaps religious question. How does this align with God's ability to, to make and foresee the future? But it's really become more of a discussion around determinism in more recent centuries. And there's this interesting thing that you see where we seem to have this kind of a break where there are various external influences. For instance, me saying, hey, can you please raise your hand is obviously an external influence. There might be some kind of internal influences. You look around, you see, oh, other people raise their hands. I guess I should raise my hand now and things like that. But still, we feel that there is a break between those influences and our conscious decision that then controls the behavior, that there is, that we are somewhat immune to those external influences and internal influences. So, yeah. So as I alluded to before, right, the question of free will is not new, and it was discussed already in this conference. And it was discussed before, right, by various, at least Western philosophers, right? Plato, Aquinas, René Descartes, Kant, Nietzsche, Harry Frankfurt, and more recently, Benjamin Libet. And this is really where neuroscience joined the debate in the 1983 paper by Benjamin Libet. So, going back to the intuitive order of events, that when you raise your hand, you at some point, I think, felt that you decided to raise your hand, which then caused your hand to rise, right? So there's this causality going from your decision, your idea, to the action. So this suggests an intuitive order of events that, first of all, there's the onset of the conscious intention to move. At some time after that, there would be information in the brain about the action, and then there would be the actual movement. So this is the intuitive order of events, right? Conscious intention, then there's information in the brain, and then there's movement. The Libet experiment suggests that it might perhaps be more complicated. So the Libet experiment was very much, there are various versions of it, and the very original one was actually like flexing your wrist. But in other versions of the Libet experiment, it was whenever you feel like it, raise one of your hands. The only other difference was that people had this thing that is now often called the Libet clock. So there was this dot that was rotating around, and the people were asked to, again, raise their hand whenever they felt like it, but to also note where the dot was when they first had the urge to move. So, maybe it was here around 12, right? When you had the urge to move, let's say your right hand, and then you raise your hand. Now, another thing that was done in that experiment is that electroencephalography, or EEG, was collected from the head, from the brain of the person. And in particular, Libet looked at something called the readiness potential, which was found about 20 years before the Libet experiment in 1965 by Kornhuber and Dike. And this readiness potential was, again, at that time, known to precede voluntary action. So if you look at the results of the Libet experiment, so you've got your readiness potential here. You've got movement onset here at 0, right? This is where the person moves. And you could claim that when the readiness potential starts is when the information exists in the brain about the action. However, the interesting bit about the Libet experiment is that the people reported having had their first urge to move only around 200 milliseconds before movement onset. So note the order of events here, right? The intuitive order of events we talked about before, onset of conscious intention, information in the brain, then movement onset. But in the Libet experiment, these two are flipped. So you have information that exists in the brain, the onset of the readiness potential that starts before the onset of the conscious intention. So this has puzzled many people because if you try to think about it, wait, what's actually happening in this gap here between, I mean, there's already information in the brain, right? Supposedly, but the participant has not yet reported deciding. So some people have said, well, does that mean that the decision was made unconsciously? And some have taken it even more generally to suggest that maybe unconscious decisions, maybe that conscious, that our conscious bit, or that our consciousness, or that our conscious intentions are not part of the causal chain that leads to actions more generally. So basically, maybe our conscious thought, our decision to raise our hand does not actually even cause our hand to rise. And if that is the case, if our decisions are generally made unconsciously, then many have argued that this has wide-ranging implications for free will, for moral responsibility, for economic theories, and various other pillars of human society. I should also note that the Libet experiment is quite, I mean, it's well cited. You could say it's quite a seminal study, certainly in the neuroscience of volition, but more generally in neuroscience. I think when I looked in January, it was 4,000. I think now it's close to 4,200 times already that it was cited in the academic press. It's also mentioned quite frequently in various lay media. And for example, just here, the New York Times has mentioned the Libet study 35 times, and this is, again, just the New York Times. So, of course, the Libet experiment has undergone various criticisms, suggesting that Libet conflates things like intentions, urges, decisions, and so on. And given that this is, that I'm assuming there are quite a few philosophers in the crowd, I probably don't need to say too much about that. But there are other questions that were asked in which we were involved. For instance, this idea that the readiness potential starts really early, does that really mean that the decision that the decision has already been made? Maybe it's more something like a bias or a preference that you can read off the brain, but it's not necessarily already a decision. There was another question about whether the Libet experiment really the Libet experiment really generalizes from arbitrary to deliberate decisions. However, beyond these points, I would say that for this dramatic interpretation of the Libet experiment, the one that basically consciousness does not cause our actions, or it's not part of the causal chain leading to our actions, at least three things would need to hold. One is that the onset of the readiness potential here at the beginning really needs to be, at least roughly, the onset of some kind of an unconscious intention to move. And then you also need the W time at the other side of this gap that we talked about before needs to be the onset of the conscious intention to move, at least roughly, because then you have this gap between the unconscious and the conscious, right? And I would say a third thing needs to happen, which is that these Libet results that are made about these very simple, raise your hand whenever you feel like it decisions, need to generalize about the big decisions in life that we care about when we talk about free will, or even more so moral responsibility. I mean, no one is going to take you to court because you raise your right hand and not your left hand for no reason and no purpose, right? Um, so let's see how much these things, all three of them, hold. Um, there is, I would venture to say, increasing evidence that the readiness potential, or the onset of the readiness potential, is not really the onset of the unconscious intention to move. And an influential paper in that respect was written by my colleague now here at Chapman, Aaron Scherger, where he had another view of the readiness potential. It's not that once the readiness potential starts, that's where the decision has been made, and then it's just kind of ballistic from there. The readiness potential just kind of shoots up uh, until movement onset, but rather he had this, I think right now, quite influential idea of this stochastic accumulator, where on every trial, there's some kind of an accumulation over noise that at some point reaches a threshold, at which point that's the decision to move. And then on another trial, it might reach the threshold here. So some movements are earlier or later. And then you can show that if you align everything to movement onset, and you have this kind of correlated integration of noise, or correlated noise, you get this thing that looks much like the readiness potential. So according to this model, nothing really happens at the onset of the readiness potential. It's kind of like the beginning of the trial. There's not much happening. And I mean, I'll talk about an extension that we've made of that model later on in the talk, but this has been, I think, a strong motivator for some people to question whether the onset of the readiness potential is really the onset of the unconscious intention to move. Okay, what about the other side of this, right? The W time, what Libet called that time when you make the decision, or have the intention, or perhaps have the urge. Again, those are different things that Libet conflated, but all those things. So there is increasing evidence that W time is actually not the onset of an unconscious intention to move. In fact, I think this came out in mid or late 2023. A bunch of us got together and basically reviewed, the W time. And I mean, among other things, we reviewed some studies in the literature. There's a relatively famous one by Banks and Isham, who showed that if you let people press a button when they don't exactly feel when they're pressing the button, it's a bit like these capacitor buttons on elevators sometimes, that you don't feel exactly when you press them, or sometimes if you get close enough to your phone, it already gets pressed, right? So you don't know exactly when you're pressing. So they hid people's hands so they couldn't see when they're pressing. And what they did is they gave them false feedback with a tone that was delayed by some milliseconds after their button press. And what they saw was that W time moved with that delay. And there were other studies. This one is older, by Hakwan Lau and colleagues, that show that if you TMS people at the time that they press the button, it actually influences their W time. So it suggests that, this study suggests that W time is influenced by when you think you moved. So it might be backward inferred from when you think you moved. This study suggests that there are certainly processes that are happening at or after movement onset that influence W time. So all of this has led us, in that paper that I just mentioned, to really question whether W is useful. And we ended up saying that we conclude that this simple W time should be discarded as a measure of the onset of the experience intending to move. As for the third question, whether the Libet results can be generalized from arbitrary decisions to more deliberate real life situations. There was a study that with my co-authors, Liad Mudger from Tel Aviv, Gideon Yaffe from Yale, and Christoph Koch. Well, he was then at Caltech, but now at the Allen Institute. We have done, and what we asked was specifically comparing between arbitrary and deliberate decisions. And the way we did that was in a donation paradigm where we asked people to make decisions between different nonprofits. And there were well, broadly speaking, I'm not going to go into all the details, although happy to in the Q&A. But broadly speaking, there were two conditions. One in which people made deliberate decisions. So they sought two nonprofits that they, I mean, one of them was typically one that they liked a bit more than the other. And they had to decide which one they prefer, and they would press the button, and they were told something that was true, which is that their button presses in those trials really determined a donation of $1,000 to one of those nonprofits. So that was the deliberate condition. And the arbitrary condition, things on the screen looked much the same, but people were told that no matter which button they press, both nonprofits would get $500. So it doesn't matter which button they press. And the results that we got were, so for the arbitrary decisions, we got something that looked much like the readiness potential. But for deliberate decisions, when their decisions did matter, it was generally flat. So we didn't really see a readiness potential to speak of. So from all of this, I would say that there is really scant evidence for Libet's claim, or that, well, actually, yeah, Libet made that claim too. I mean, he went a bit back and forth, but a lot of people after Libet at least claim that consciousness plays no role in human action formation. So I don't really think there's evidence to support that. But I do think that the Libet studies did leave us with various interesting questions related to the neural mechanisms underlying self-initiated action, and in particular, the readiness potential and its nature and what gives rise to the readiness potential. There are also questions about the role of consciousness in decision-making, of course. Okay, I mean, if it does not have a role, so what role does it have exactly? And I mean, this field has claimed to have societal implications, so that's interesting to ask about as well. So I wanted to tell you a bit about a study that we've done trying to understand, among other things, the potential neuronal underpinning of the readiness potential using a theoretical model, but I'll tell you more about it now. And basically what we did is we created this spiking neural network model through which we tried to account for spontaneous actions happening and also for this readiness potential. And what we did was we created a network of 400 spiking neurons, and it was a recurrent network, so these neurons were connected to each other. And generally speaking, you can kind of titrate how much these neurons are connected to each other. So you can create what's called a completely homogeneous network, where every neuron is as likely to be connected to any other neuron. So that's at the one extreme. So there's no real preference to any kind of clustering or something like that. So these neurons are basically, they excite some other neurons, but then they're also, through some kind of an inhibitory population of neurons, they also inhibit each other. So you get some somewhat interesting dynamics. At the other extreme, you get what are called winner-take-all networks. In this case, we created a situation where there are 4 clusters, So each neuron in this cluster, let's say, is connected only to other neurons in this cluster, and same for any other cluster. So there are no connections between the clusters. So each neuron in its own cluster just excites other neurons in that cluster and inhibits, through this inhibitory connection, the activity in the other clusters. So what happens in this kind of network is that if one of the clusters gets slightly more active than the others, it starts being more and more active because it's self activating, and it kills off the activity in the other clusters. And that's why it's called a winner take all. So once one of them starts winning by a bit, they will just continue to win. But there's a midway situation that we called rather than a winner take all, we called it a clustered condition, where each neuron is more likely to be connected to the other neurons in its own cluster, but you also have connections between clusters. So I'll show you in a minute why that's interesting. So, and the other thing is that you can, because these are spiking neural networks, you can actually talk about the synapses between the networks. And it's interesting here to note that most spiking neural networks use these kind of fast synapses, meaning you integrate all the information quickly. We use these more slow synapses to integrate information more slowly. And we focused on this regime, and we got a kind of activity that you see here, where at some point, one of the clusters starts shooting up, right? And by that cluster shooting up, it tends to lower the activity in the other clusters. I think you can see it here. And that activity ramps up. But I mean, interestingly, in this regime, at some point, that ramp up will actually kind of die off, and then another cluster will ramp up. So it is not a winner-take-all network. So they kind of move between these clusters, but you can see that the ramp up is slow, right? And this slow ramp up is reminiscent of the readiness potential. We'll talk more about this in a minute. So one thing that we did is we try to validate our results against intracranial recordings that were done in humans. This is a study by Yitzhak Fried and colleagues that was published in 2011. And it's interesting that we had our slow, and I mean, depending on how we did the synapses, we could do this kind of slow rises or slow decreases in activity, and the fast ones. And you could see this kind of thing also happening in their data set. And if you look at some specific neurons in our data set, you can see this kind of general rise or fall. And again, you can see the same thing in the empirical data. Now, interestingly, if you go back here and you think about, so you've got these 4 clusters, one of them goes up, right? But the others actually decrease. So you've got 3 clustering. You can see them here in this raster plot. These clusters tend to fire less while this fires more. But overall in the network, there is actually less firing. So if you look at these slow synapses, you see this, if you look at overall the network, kind of like EEG style view, you see something that would be reminiscent of the readiness potential, right? Because you see this decrease overall in the network for these slow synapses. So, and just to conclude, what we think we've seen here is, so we have proposed a model, right, that gives us spontaneous initiation of voluntary action, and it's really spontaneous. I mean, if we go back here, if you could have gone a few seconds back here, and there's just nothing happening, and then all of a sudden, one of these clusters starts ramping up, and you have this thing that you could say looks like a readiness potential, but it's really, I mean, it's really a spontaneous behavior from the network. There's nothing that we put into that network to make that behavior start then. So this is a model for spontaneous initiation of voluntary action from just really ongoing spiking neural activity. And these voluntary actions are preceded by this slow ramping signals that I showed you. And it tends to recreate this readiness potential if you think about some kind of an EEG proxy signal that integrates over the entire network. And our model was generally validated in using that Fried et al. Data from frontal cortical single neuron recordings in humans. In this case, these were epilepsy patients that were implanted for clinical purposes. So that's a bit about that. And then I want to tell you about one other study that we did, which we think shows that the readiness potential does not reflect the conscious volition in a probe paradigm. And this was done really in response to another study that was done in Patrick Haggard's lab a few years ago. And that they did a probe paradigm where instead of asking people, when did you decide using a Libet clock, that you can do something else, which is something like from time to time probe them and in some way ask them, did you decide already or not? So what they did in this experiment is they had people make self-paced movements, and they said that if you are probed and you were preparing to move immediately. So again, whenever you feel like it, you press a button, let's say, right? But you're told if the probe comes and you're already preparing to move, then move immediately. And what they showed was, so in those situations where people pressed the button, suggesting that they were preparing to move, they got, I mean, note that in their case, the negative is up. This is like kind of like old school EEG. The negative used to be up, but it's basically, I mean, if you would show negative going downwards, as is more common, you would get a downward deflection, as is similar to the readiness potential. So, but anyway, they showed that this preparation to move is related to something akin to a readiness potential, while if you're not preparing to move, it's kind of flat. So what they interpreted these results to mean was that the readiness potential is somehow specifically associated with this conscious experience. So, you know, there's the onset of the readiness potential, and then maybe you slowly become conscious of it towards, conscious of your intention to move towards movement onset. So this seems to support something actually happening at the onset of the readiness potential. So we had a problem with their design, because in their design, there could be two reasons for people to press a button after the probe. One is the reason they had in mind. It was just, you know, the participants are aware of having been preparing to move, so they press a button. But there can be also another reason for people to press a button, which is if the probe comes really close to button press and you're already intending to press, you can't stop yourself from pressing the button. So this is a situation where you're already moving, right? So, and we know that if you move, you get a readiness potential. So if they could be confusing two situations, one where you'd expect a readiness potential, one where you would not, and then on average, you'd get somewhat of a readiness potential. Okay, so we did a different experiment. Again, it was a self-paced movement task, and again, we did a probe paradigm, but ours was actually more similar to the original probe paradigms by Matsuhashi and Hallett, and in the sense that we told people, okay, whenever you feel like it, you know, press the button. However, if a probe comes and if you are preparing to move, try to refrain from moving. Don't move. Veto your movement if you can. So on some trials, the participants just moved, right? They pressed the button before the probe came. There was no issue. On other trials, they heard the probe, and then we actually asked them to report after they heard the probe. Were you intending to move? Yes, unsure, or no? And there were yet other trials where they heard the probe, but they still pressed the button. Actually, what was conflated in the Paris Bukharaz study that I mentioned before from Patrick's lab. So in our case, the nice thing is that we can tease apart these failure to inhibit trials from trials where people report, yes, I was intending to move. So what do we get? Well, our results look like this. Here is the situation where people prepare to move. And here's the situation where people do not prepare to move. These are the EEGs from both. And if you do statistics here, there's nothing. I mean, these are not, there's no statistical difference between them that's reliable, right? Now, interestingly, as you'd expect, in black here, you see trials where participants actually move. And in green, you see trials where they couldn't inhibit themselves. So the probe came too late. They also ended up moving. And of course, you get something that looks like a readiness potential. Now, if you do what we think they did, which is combining this preparation to move with the cannot inhibit movement trials together, you get this, which, I mean, again, this is flipped because ours is negative and theirs is positive, but it's that, right? They're the same or very similar. So we think that that really explains their results from the 2019 paper. We also then did some more analyses that I won't get into, some modeling work to show that really the only way that we were able with drift diffusion models to explain our results was with a version of what's called a dual stage drift diffusion model. But I mean, I'm not going to get into that. So, and I mean, I think we just discussed the conclusions already. Okay, so I would like, as I pointed out in the abstract, though, given the focus of this conference, to talk more generally, besides just talking about more and more of our results, to actually say something more generally about how neuroscience and philosophy can help each other. And I'll start by asking why neuroscience needs philosophy. I mean, you could say that historically philosophy just had, you know, everything was philosophy. All of science was philosophy. You could argue, again, I'm not going to make too strong an argument for that, but you could argue that that's the case. And then with time, kind of science conquered more and more, and philosophers tended to perhaps feel that science is encroaching on what used to be their turf. Some even claim that this term neuroimperialism. I think I heard it, but then somebody asked me where I found it, and I looked and looked for it, and I couldn't find it. So maybe I made it up, or maybe it's now my term, whatever. But this is, you could claim, a kind of neuroimperialism, right, where neuroscience kind of takes over from other fields, in this case, philosophy. But I would actually claim that neuroscience really does need philosophy, because neuroscience has started to tackle more and more abstract concepts. Neuroscience now deals with emotions, with free will, with consciousness, and I mean with other things that are very high level. The concepts themselves are problematic, and if you just use your intuitive understanding of those concepts, you may end up like Libet, conflating urges and decisions and intentions. And I mean, you might be working quite hard on experiments that are inherently problematic. And well, there's a field out there, and again, I probably don't have to convince you of that, called philosophy, where conceptual clarity is key, is the hallmark of the field. So that collaboration between neuroscientists and philosophers, I think, is quite important. Now, I mean, you could say, if conceptual issues are central to neuroscientific investigations, of course, you can also say, well, we know neuroscientists are not really well trained in conceptual analysis. So you could say, well, I mean, they can either learn more philosophy themselves, or they could, as I mentioned before, collaborate with philosophers. So maybe neuroscientists should just learn more philosophy. And of course, that's true. Neuroscientists should learn more philosophy, but to really expect them to become philosophers is problematic, right? I mean, philosophy is a profession. It's not just something that you do when you've had one too many drinks that night at the bar. But and in that sense, someone can be a really good neuroscientist, know how to really create good experiments, find good models, do the right controls, and so on. But that doesn't mean that they would be a good philosopher, right? They might just not have what it takes. And that's to require every neuroscientist to become a philosopher if they want to deal with these high-level concepts is really problematic. And you could also say that neuroscience is already quite competitive as is. So requiring them to also become philosophers is just going to be almost impossible. So I would say that neuroscientists that tend to think that they're philosophers, watch out. I'm not sure exactly what you think you are. So maybe we should collaborate, right? So maybe it makes more sense for neuroscientists and philosophers to work with each other, but of course that has its own issues. So I guess one question to ask for neuroscientists, at least, is how can philosophers help neuroscientists? Well, philosophers can help design experiments, right? They can help clarify the research questions and hypotheses when you design the neuroscientific experiments. They can also help interpret the results. Neuroscientists, I mean, like all scientists, they find something and the initial urge is, oh my God, this means like this really big thing. And then, you talk to your colleagues, but also certainly you talk to philosophers, you realize maybe it means this smaller thing than you initially thought. So philosophers can really help with the interpretation of the results. And they can also help design and evaluate models. And I wanted to give an example in this regard. This is work with Marcel Brass, who unfortunately was not able to join us, and with Renato, who is happily with us. And this is, I should say, it's still ongoing, so I'll go through it briefly, but just mention that. So what we did was, I mean, this all started when Renato came to Chapman for a conference and brought me a copy of his book, which is a Free Will in Portuguese, which I'm going to butcher now. And it was something like Libre Arbitre or something like that. And again, sorry for butchering the title of the book. But then it got us starting to talk about that. The notion of freedom and free will is just different in different languages, and Germanic languages versus Latin languages. So we said, well, why don't we try to study that? And we thought of Canada as a test case because you have the French Canadians and the English-speaking Canadians. So we took monolingual French and English, and we were wondering about their concept of free will. So to try to study this concept without contamination from language, we try to use these comic strips that I hope your screen is good enough to see, but there were some specifically related to choice, like you're trying to decide where to go on vacation, and then are you going to go to the beach or to the mountains, and you go to the mountains. You're trying to decide whether to become a policeman or a fireman, and you decide, I think in this case, to become a fireman, or maybe you're trying to decide between pasta and pizza, and you go for the pasta. So these were the choice-related comic strips. We had on the other side the willpower-related comic strips, like you're looking at the scales in the morning and you think, oh, maybe I shouldn't be eating that cake. Or maybe you're trying to climb up that mountain that's really tall, or you're kind of persevering when doing a math problem or something along those lines. And then we had some neutral comic strips of like listening to music and reading a book and just walking down the street. And then we asked, does this cartoon represents free will? And from strongly disagree to strongly agree, we asked that in English and in French, but we really tried to have as little language in all of this as possible. And well, I mean, our initial results were actually disappointing in the sense that we could not really see a difference. So English here is in blue, and French is in this magenta color. And you can see that they're not really much different from each other, right? I mean, you can also, this is English and French, choice, willpower, neutral, choice, willpower, neutral. So, I mean, this is a different depiction of the same results. But so we didn't really get a difference between them. And if anything, we actually have evidence from a Bayesian analysis that they're generally the same for almost all the questions. The base factor is around 0.1. But we did see differences in the total ratings, right? You can see that generally people think of choice as more related to free will than willpower. And in this case, even neutral was on average higher than willpower. So we went on to do a second study asking whether choice and willpower are similarly associated with free will. And we kept the same cartoons, but in this case, we asked about each one of them whether it represents choice, willpower, doing what one wants, or the absence of constraints. And in this case, we went again to Canada, but this time only looked at English-speaking Canadians because we really couldn't see a difference between the English and the French. And we generally saw that free will is more strongly associated with the choice ones here than with the willpower ones, except for perhaps the mountain climbing example. But these were really, I mean, this is agree, neutral, or disagree. You can see that these two are actually in the disagree zone. This one is the dieting, and this one is the math. And the neutrals are somewhat, somewhere in the middle there. And this let us speculate, at least, and again, this is work in progress, so these conclusions, we're still working on this, but while we found no difference between French and English, we did find differences again between the comics depicting choice and free will. And our second experiment suggests that those differences really might be due to the fact that willpower is associated with doing what one does not want to do, or with the presence of constraints. And I mean, those, the not doing what you want and the presence of constraints have been previously shown to be associated with a lack of free will. So again, this is with a grain of salt because we're still working on this, but this is where it seems to be going. So back to my discussion there about benefits for collaboration between neuroscience and philosophers. I would say that there's actually another benefit. Philosophy and neuroscience, I think, move at different paces. And I think this is good. I don't think this is criticism. Philosophy tends to be a slower field. Philosophers take their time. They debate topics for a long time, right? And in neuroscience, there's this rush for the next experiment, next results, next moving on to the next data set, next whatever. And it's interesting now that I think most of the ongoing debate about the Libet experiment is now in philosophy. It's not really in neuroscience. It seems that neuroscience has moved on, but this is not a bad thing. It means that some of the questions can be debated longer, right, and more thoroughly, even those that are quote unquote left behind by scientists. So there's also the flip question of, well, we've talked about how philosophers can help neuroscientists. What about, can neuroscientists help philosophers? I would argue that they can. I mean, one example is the Libet experiments and all their follow-up studies that have really galvanized a lot of the debate, or some debate at least, I would say, among philosophers And many of the citations of lipid studies come from philosophers discussing those. But there's also another thing that is worth noting, which is that some philosophical discussions can benefit from neuroscientific data, right? I mean, I would certainly not claim that all, and perhaps not even most philosophical debates, but there are some that can. And one example is the principle of double effect. In the version that I'm talking about here, this has to do with teasing apart the notion of intention from foresight. I mean, we know that the law tends to distinguish intention to harm from foresight of harm. Okay, these are two different things. But there are, of course, debates about whether in a situation where the action that you're doing can help you, whether you could foresee, or so I would put this differently, in a situation where the harm that you foresee could help you, can you then foresee that but not intend that harm? And there are ongoing philosophical or legal philosophical debates about this. An example you could think about is, so you've got some villain here who's trying to snatch a bag from an elderly person, and you can say that so there could be two different situations. One, their intention is to snatch the bag and to make this elderly person fall to the ground, because if they're falling to the ground, they're not going to try to chase them or anything. So it's actually better for them to harm this person and make them fall to the ground so they can get away with the bag. Or you could say that their intention was really to snatch the bag, and they foresaw that the elderly person could fall to the ground, but they did not intend for that to happen. And again, the question is, can this situation really exist, or is it always that, well, if it's beneficial for you that that happens, that you would actually intend for that to happen? So the difference, right, that while the law distinguishes intention from foresight in these situations, the difference between intention and foresight is one of your mental state. So if you could tease apart the neural correlates of intention from foresight, then that would be beneficial for these philosophical debates. So again, this is a work in progress, but I'm just mentioning that we've tried to do something like that. And of course, we're not going to take bags from elderly people and make them fall to the ground. But so we tried to do this lab situation. We created a small frog that a big frog that wants to get to the small frog, and it has to kind of jump through this area here. And there would be these dragonflies that are flying by. And if the frog hits the dragonfly while it jumps, it gets points. And there are also bubbles. If it hits the bubbles, it does not get points. So you've got a situation where here you intend to hit the target and here you don't. And you also have, I mean, sometimes there's the dragonflies are rare, so you're unlikely to hit them. And at other times they're more abundant, so you're more likely to hit them. So you've got like a 2x2 design of, and this is roughly, it actually is more complex than this, but there's a 2x2 design of whether you intend or do not intend, and you foresee or do not foresee that you would hit them. And again, this is roughly, but our results suggest that EEG can, at least to some extent, tease apart the intention from the foresight. And you can see it here, that intentions are associated with what's called the feedback-related negativity, or the FRN component. You can see it more for the fly than for the bubble condition, while foresight is associated more with a P3 component that is, we generally know, associated with surprise. So when you have things that are unexpected versus things that are expected. Again, it gets more complex than this, and there's actually a quite complex follow-up experiment that we're doing. But I just wanted to say that there is at least some hope for trying to get at some interesting philosophical questions and providing neuroscientific evidence for the debate in those questions. So I mean, but what I do want to say is that it is very often the case that that neuroscientific evidence cannot help to settle philosophical debates. Okay, and generally speaking, neuroscientists are not well equipped to get entangled in complex philosophical discussions, some of which have been going on for millennia. But an interesting aspect here is that if you gather a few philosophers around the table, they would often not agree on many things, but they might often agree that despite their differing positions on some matter, let's say related to, I mean, one might be a compatibilist, another might be a libertarian or what have you in terms of their views on free will, but they might still agree that that experiment that you're suggesting or some tweak in that experiment would be beneficial to from a philosophical standpoint. And that I think is quite valuable to do. So you bring around the table of philosophers who disagree with each other, and if they all agree that this is a good experiment, then this suggests that the results of that experiment could influence the philosophical debate, or at least that it's getting at the right concepts for the neuroscience. Okay, so just, I mean, I guess it was discussed before that there are these collaborations between neuroscientists and philosophers that I'm a part of. So there's this consortium, the Neurophilosophy of Free Will Consortium that Renato mentioned before, that has a bunch of scientists from around the world and a bunch of philosophers. And we have been working together on various projects. There's also a more recent group that I've put together but this is, I'm sorry, I missed. So Jen Collinger is a neuroscientist and Lauren Ross is a philosopher. I'm sorry that these pictures are flipped. They should have been they're in the wrong place. But you've got philosophers and neuroscientists then asking about the notion of causality in spontaneous actions, right? Like you've got the spontaneous action that comes from supposedly there was nothing there before, and all of a sudden you have a spontaneous action. So how do you think about cause and mechanism in those situations? So it's quite useful and fruitful for neuroscientists and philosophers to collaborate. But I would just want to say that there are some challenges in this collaboration. You've got your usual distrust between fields. Some neuroscientists think that philosophers have already had 2,000 years to solve the free will problem. If they couldn't do it in 2,000 years, why should we listen to them? Now it's our turn. Again, I think that's naive for reasons I explained, but you hear this. And then you get some philosophers who say that neuroscience cannot contribute to the free will debate on first principles. So again, there's kind of distrust from both sides. And there's also the issue of sometimes knowing a little bit about something is actually worse than knowing nothing at all. I think there are neuroscientists that think that they're good philosophers, perhaps even better than those professional philosophers, which is problematic. And you have some philosophers that understand neuroscience at a superficial level. And that can be problematic as well. And then there's also sometimes frustration because I mentioned that generally speaking, neuroscience moves faster than philosophy, but there are situations where it's the opposite. I've had situations where I was sitting with a philosopher designing an experiment, and it took us months and months, and then we agreed on the design, said, okay, let's do it. And then I don't know, months and months pass, and the philosopher says, hey, what's going on? And so did you get the results? And I said, no, I'm still trying to get ethical approval and recruit the research assistant and so on. So some things really take a lot of time in neuroscience, and that could be frustrating for philosophers. But I should say that when philosophers and neuroscientists talk to each other and have joint meetings as you're having now, I think that I've at least had philosophers note and surprise that actually, well, some neuroscientists do some sort of philosophy in what they do, and but it's also worth noting that, I mean, these disciplines sometimes just speak different languages. So it really takes a long time for neuroscientists and philosophers to learn to talk to each other. So you've got other barriers like different career incentives. Philosophers like books more, and the neuroscientists like papers more. Grants are more important for neuroscientists than philosophers. Scientists tend to work in ever-growing groups. Philosophers seem to like to work, generally speaking, alone or in very small groups. I've actually once published a paper with a bunch of philosophers, and a few of them mentioned that as far as they know, this is the paper with most philosophers together on it that they've ever seen. So yeah, there's maybe something in that. It's also important to understand what to expect from one another. So neuroscientists can make progress on, neural mechanisms and things like that. They cannot help with questions regarding whether determinism is true in the world, right? And philosophers can help clarify concepts, sharpen research questions. They cannot help with statistical analyses or designing the best control condition and things like that. It, of course, does not mean that the neuroscience needs to become a philosopher or vice versa. And it does mean that people need to be willing to put in the time and the effort to work with each other. And it's worth remembering that being humble here is important, right? Having lunch with a philosopher does not make you any more of a philosopher than eating a fish for lunch makes you have gills. So to finish, I would just say that if you really want to create a truly interdisciplinary collaboration between neuroscientist and philosopher, at least in my opinion, and of course there are many ways people can do this, but in what I've learned is that it really takes time, right? You need each person to understand what each person brings to the collaboration. You need to find a question that's important enough for both parties to engage in over the months that it will take to find common language and so on. And of course, it could be that it doesn't work, but in the same way that if you collaborate with somebody in your field and it doesn't work, you don't stop collaborating. In the same way here, if you collaborate with someone from another field and it doesn't work, it doesn't mean that you should stop collaborating. And it would be good if there was an incentive structure through grants and other things to foster this collaboration. We've tried to do some of that through our consortium, but that, of course, takes funding. And I will just end by saying that together with Michael Robinson, who's a philosopher here at Chapman, we thought that it would be really important to start this collaboration early. So we devised this course called the Philosophy and Neuroscience of Free Will that we teach together. What we do is we take science students and humanities students, mainly science, mainly neuroscience and psychology, humanities, mainly philosophy, and we pick them such that they're together in the class. They go over neuroscientific texts and philosophical texts related to free will. And in the end of the course, we create these cross-disciplinary groups that they have to put a proposal for a new experiment that would move the field ahead, and in these joint groups between neuroscientists and philosophers. And if anyone is interested, I'm happy to discuss this more if anybody wants to bring such a course to their institution. I mean, Michael and I also put together this video where we talked about investigating free will and neuroscience and philosophers. And if anyone is interested, this is the barcode for that. And this is the end. So I'll just leave that barcode there for a moment. And thank you very much. It's about a 20-minute animated video, 18 minutes. I don't remember exactly, but I think it's kind of fun, but I'm not really objective. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Uri, very much. So, Thomas?
I just had a quick question. That was great. Do you think maybe the reason in the latest study that you reported that they seem to gravitate more towards choice than will just has to do with the fact that the phenomenology of choice is pretty indeterministic, so it's a natural place for us to view prototypically free action. And then will is, like you said, it often gets implicated in contexts where we feel in some ways unfree, like we're having to overcome something. But that really it's the fact that the choice is the indeterminism, an indeterministic frame is sort of built into the choice scenarios, and that's just like the right grounds for them to have their free will intuition.
So of course I don't know. I think this is something that's worth for us to tackle in our discussion. You're saying that when you have a choice, it's really, I mean, there are two things that you can do, and you're really struggling with, is it one or the other? So there's, in that sense, there's the unsettledness or the indeterminism there. Let's think about our willpower. Let me bring up the relevant slide here so we can look at it together. Here, it's this one. So if we look at the willpower, then, I mean, you could claim that here there's a choice to eat the cake or not eat the cake. And maybe here there's a choice to climb or not to climb. And here, I don't know, you could give up or do the math problem. But I mean, you may well be right that it's not as inherent as it is here, right? This is all about the choice. But so I think it's actually an interesting point. And if you really want to get at that, then you probably need a yet another study where your willpower either does or does not more clearly incorporate choice, and see if that makes a difference. But yeah, I think it's a good point. Thank you.
So I'm interested in the interpretation, or maybe the reinterpretation of some of the Libet evidence in a way that's more amenable to the idea that we still have free will, that lots of stuff isn't happening, or decisions aren't made before we become consciously aware of them. And I think most of my exposure to that was through Al Mealy, so it's nice to see the actual science behind some of those claims that he seems to be making. But I worry that there's still a, I don't know, Libet-style challenge that you could pose based on the neuroscience evidence. It still challenges the notion of free will, which is, if you take that accumulator model that you put up before, it looks like there's a lot of stuff that's going on before I become consciously aware of an intention or of making a decision to act, and so I worry that the kind of neuroscientifically informed challenge to free will just changes its shape to, okay, look, it's not like you make decisions before you become aware, but you've basically made a decision, right? You're 99% of the way there before your consciousness kicks in. And I wonder if that is, I mean, obviously it's a little bit cutesy interpretation, but I wonder if, I mean, is that sort of interpretation open to the person who still wants to push a scientific skepticism about free will?
When you say scientific skepticism, what do you, so give me the flip side, the flip view.
Well, then I would think that whatever role consciousness is, so it goes something like this. Consciousness is necessary for exercising free will, and it looks like when we look at sort of the neural implementation of our decision making, the role that consciousness plays is vanishingly small, because you look at all of the stuff that's going on before we're consciously aware of making a decision. It's like, well, okay, I mean, is my consciousness sort of like moving a tiny amount of the accumulation there? So I think the idea is something like, it looks like way more stuff is going on than I expected. My consciousness plays a very small role. You've made some room for it, but it's much smaller than what I wanted as a proponent of free will.
Okay, so thank you. I think I now better understand your question. By the way, before I answer, I should just say, you mentioned Al Mealy. He's also had a central role. Michael Robinson, my collaborator here at Chapman, did a postdoc with Al Mealy, and when I came to Chapman, Al Mealy was the one who actually let us know that we're both in the same university and we should talk to each other. So kudos to Al Mealy here. But besides that, um, I mean, so part of this is, well, okay, I'll say two different things. There is a version of the model that you now see here on the screen that was published in 2018 in another paper by Aaron Sugar, where he suggested that one way to put like W time into this framework is to have like a sub threshold. So somewhere here, let's say, have another threshold, and when you cross that, you feel the intention to move. This is not going to help with what you're saying, because this is still the same kind of well, then why do you get to that threshold, and so on. But that's just to mention that there have been attempts to try to incorporate the ability to report at some point that you're about to move into these models. But to your question, I think the bigger issue is that we're not really sure how to model consciousness in all of these things more generally. You could claim, for instance, that so in this model here, the drift diffusion model, I mean, this is a differential equation, but the point is that there might be more or less urgency to move. So the more urgency there is, the faster this thing will shoot up towards the threshold. Again, it gets more complicated. There is a leak term, but generally speaking, there's that. So you could argue that consciousness plays a role more in the, in setting the parameters for this model's accumulation. I don't know how satisfying that is, but that could be something that could be the role. There's even a different version. I mean, I was about to say a different version of this model, but it's actually somewhat of a different model where, so in this case, there's integration over noise. You could create another situation where the model just shoots up deterministically, but the slope of the model gets chosen in the beginning. So it's called a ballistic accumulator, and basically you just decide on what the urgency is, and then from there it's a ballistic process. It just shoots up in a linear line, to a threshold, and you can create some of these. There's now somewhat of a debate in the field between different models, but really, what is the role of consciousness in these decisions is, and how to model that is something that, at least personally, I've been grappling with, and I don't have like an answer that can come and I say, hey, that's it, we've cracked it. I mean, I'm not sure we ever will, of course, but it's something that I think the field should, and to some extent is trying to think about. I mean, if you claim that consciousness does have a role, then how can we show it? How can we show it empirically? Can you somehow transition from a situation where you're not conscious of something to a situation where you're conscious of something, and then actually show that delta consciousness has an effect? And I don't know I mean, I haven't found a situation like that. If you want to discuss more, I'm happy to, because I've been trying to think about it. But yeah, this is, I guess, what I can say at this point.
Hi, Uri. Peter C. here. Nice seeing you again.
Hey.
Hey.
Nice to see you.
Yeah, so, personally, I don't think that the readiness potential is very relevant to issues of free will. But even if you did believe that, to answer Sam here, I think a conceptual mistake is to think that just because the readiness potential at time zero deflects off the baseline, there's no reason to think that it is alone the sole cause of the action later, or even or a sufficient cause. So by analogy, right? If a pitcher pitches a baseball at time zero, and that leads to a home run, nobody would say that the pitching of the ball is the sole cause of the home run. I mean, it's necessary for the eventual home run, but so was the hitting of the ball by the baseball player. So you can imagine and that would be analogous to, W. So, the pitching is analogous to the deflection off the baseline of the readiness potential, and W might be analogous to the swinging of the bat. So both might be necessary. It's conceivable anyway. So what might be going on? There might be unconscious generation of possible actions, but W might be okay, we'll release that one versus that one. I mean, who knows what's really going on? But I think it's simplist. I think Libet he has a simplistic understanding of causation, namely that which precedes something else causes everything subsequent to that. So I just think that that's wrong. Like, we would never think that about baseball. Okay, before you comment on that, I also just wanted to ask you about your super interesting experiment with the donations and the deliberation. Have you, so you're finding there where the EEG is kind of the lack of a readiness potential for the interesting deliberation case. But have you done an MRI version to look at what is present during the deliberation case? Like, this would be very interesting to look at, where can you classify where they will donate or whether they will donate in this deliberation phase. So, like, where's deliberation happening in the brain?
Right. So let me start with your second question because it's a faster answer. So from EEG, it's kind of hard. And of course, the obvious thing is to try to do an fMRI experiment, and we're actually doing it now. So, Liad Mudrik in Tel Aviv took the lead on that. And as you know, they have some trouble there in that region of the world. So things are moving. Science is being affected by that. But we are slowly gathering MRI because, as you say, the question then is, would be interesting to do some kind of like an MVPA or something like that, and then try to see what. There are some regions we would expect, ventromedial, prefrontal, right, and so on, that we know is related to value and things like that. But in a specific paradigm where we compare arbitrary and deliberate directly, that has not been done. So we are doing this. To your first question about causality, broadly speaking, I can only say I agree. I mentioned this causality, this group of people that we've been trying to meet and chat about causality, because I think that the notion of causality, and even more so the notion of mechanism that's associated with the notion of causality, has really been built more towards things like, oh, here's a clock, we take it apart, that's the mechanism, and this wheel turns that wheel, and this is the cause of that, and so on. But when you have a recurrent neural network that is heavily complex, and A influences B, and then through C influences A back, and you get stuff that's much more convoluted. So I think that it's much harder to talk about cause and effect. But I can only agree with you that Libet had simplistic views about a lot of things. I think his main achievement was starting the field and coming up with an experiment that got people talking still, now 41 years later about that experiment. But that is yet another place. I can only agree that it's not clear that the RP is really the cause, or it could be a necessary but not sufficient condition. And one thing we have been trying to do are studies where we look at things beyond the RP. And you can do that with EEG, but it's just, you can do it, everybody does machine learning now. You can do some kind of a fancy machine learning thing. And we've tried, we've done a few of those things, but it's hard to get past 60-something% accuracy in predicting, let's say, which hand you're going to move. But if you get access to intracranial data, there it becomes much more interesting. And it seems that at least under some circumstances, we can have access to something that has a much higher predictive ability. So if you're nearing 100% accuracy of predicting, let's say, when a person would move half a second in advance, it still doesn't get you to causality, because for that you would need to wiggle stuff, right? You'd need to, you can do it maybe in a rat. You go in there and with optogenetics or something, you stop it and you show that the rat stops moving, and you don't stop it and you show that they move. So you need a bit more. But I think that in combination between animal studies of the sort that I mentioned and intracranial studies in humans, we would be able to get at things that are more, hopefully, in the end, causal, rather than just, correlational, but even, the RP is even worse, right? It's correlational on average. It's not even correlational on single trials. So it's, but I just to defend the RP for a moment, I still think it's interesting to ask why it's there. And that's what we've tried to do a bit with our spiking neural network model, to try and say, well, that's one reason you would expect something like an RP. But I think that the field is moving away from the RP, and I generally applaud that. So
thanks.
I hope that was not too long of an answer.
No, it's a complicated field. You take care.
Okay.
I do see Eddie online wanting to ask a question. I'm just mentioning
Eddie
that.
has a question. Okay.
Can you hear me?
At least I can hear you, Eddie. Hi.
Okay. Hey, great talk. Good to see you, kind of. Wish you were here in person with us. So, first of all, can you pull up the pictures of the cartoons?
Sure.
So, one point, just to kind of emphasize what Peter was saying and respond to Sam, is, that as your cartoons indicate, a big part of people's conception of free will is going to be sort of the imagining of alternatives and structuring possibilities ahead of time and plan, as each of these cartoons involves. So nobody's really studying that yet, just because it's too complicated to look at, what people are consciously planning long before they act. Or I don't know anybody who's doing really good stuff on that, other than, you guys doing it a little bit with the donations to charity. That's at least a more important decision, but it's not a long-term planning or imagining decision. But that's just a comment. The question is, can you show the next screen? Because it didn't show up for me. And the results right after this.
Can you see it now?
Okay. Yeah. So what were y'all trying to do with these cartoons exactly? Just figuring out whether people had different views by language, or?
We were wondering, because in I should have probably explained this better. Apologies. In Germanic languages, the notion of free will is associated with will, right? Which is also associated with willpower. Yeah. Again, I did not do a good job explaining this. While in Latin languages, it has to do more with the notion of choice, right? With arbitraire, with choice. So then we were wondering whether if we showed these cartoons here, some of them associated with choice and some of them associated with willpower, our hypothesis was that perhaps the French Canadians would think that the choice ones are more associated with free will, and the English Canadians would think that perhaps the willpower ones are more associated with free will. But we just see that both of them think that the choice is more associated with free will than the willpower ones.
I see. Okay. And then the next slide, the results on that are showing just.
The next slide was, we did a second study trying to understand a bit more about, where does this come from? Because there is literature out there suggesting that people's conception of free will and different. Again, I don't have to tell you, much more about this than I do, but that people's conception of free will is associated with doing what they want and absence of constraint in different cultures. So we wanted to see whether this could help explain what's going on here. And to a large extent, it does. You can see here that responses to absence of constraint. So people felt that the willpower ones had the least absence of constraint. And generally speaking, they were the only ones where people disagreed that there are absence of constraints. And here for the, for the doing what one wants, so the dieting and the math, I mean, this is very sad for me as somebody who likes math, but it seems a lot of people associate math with not doing what you want, which is, of course, on them. But anyway, math and dieting is not what, but here the mountain climbing is perhaps, but again, it could be just more of what you want to do. If you want to climb a mountain, you're going to climb a mountain. That's the interpretation we had. But I was presenting this here because there are people in the audience who know much more about this, and I was hoping to get some thoughts.
Well, yeah, I'll think about it. I have these vague intuitions that these cartoons might be really useful as some sort of, measurement of people's beliefs, and maybe even a way to use a shorthand for whether their beliefs can change in response to manipulations. But I'm not sure how yet. I got to think about it. But I'm glad you re-showed the results, and now I understand it better. Thanks a lot.
There was no way for you to understand the way I explained it before, so I'm glad you asked the question, which let me really explain the results. Thank you. Thank you, Eddie.
Okay, so Hanato had to step out. He asked me if I would tell you, Uri, thank you very much. The talk was amazing. It was great to hear your effort to try to make it easier for all of us to get along in an interdisciplinary spirit. So appreciate it, and thanks again, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm sorry I'm not there with you. And the last thing, I should have started with that, of course, but thank you so much for inviting me. I'm sorry I did not start with that. It's very early here in the morning is all I can say. I had to leave home at 6:30 to be in my office at 8 to make this. So I will excuse myself for being tired, but thank you very much for inviting me. And I hope very much that the next time I can be there in person. This auditorium looks very comfortable. I want to be there. Bye, guys.